Daria Gritsenko is a researcher, educator, and assistant professor at the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Helsinki. She's studying the digital transformation of state and society in Russia and beyond, and she's here to shed light on how to govern energy resources in the Arctic. Welcome, Daria.
If you are following the recent news, you may have heard that the Arctic is full of energy resources. Oil and gas and valuable minerals are attracting attention of companies and countries all over the world. However, what you may have not heard is that most of the Arctic communities live in energy poverty. They rely on expensive and polluting diesel brought to the Arctic from other places for their energy production. This is bad for the environment, and this hinders their economic development. How can we supply Arctic communities with efficient and sustainable energy mix remains debated. Some argue that the Arctic could run completely on renewables. Others say it's not technically viable. Then there is an argument that it actually does not matter what kind of energy the Arctic communities use because they're just so small, but what really matters is the large-scale extraction of energy in the Arctic and industrial production. So, how do we create effective and efficient energy policies for the Arctic communities? In my research, I use the concept of new carbon governance to connect energy and climate as two sides of the same coin. If we think about it, the objective of the energy policy is to provide accessible energy at reasonable prices. The main objective of climate policy is to cut energy consumption and cut carbon emissions. But if you think about it, today, the main source of carbon emissions is actually energy production. So how can we integrate these two policies with seemingly contradictory objectives? My argument is that we have to go after what these two policies have in common, and this is carbon. We have to go after carbon, we have to follow carbon. And my idea is to follow the carbon data. So the data on how much carbon is emitted and how much carbon is absorbed, the so-called carbon balance. In my research, I look at the local level, at how communities, companies, and authorities can contribute to making carbon data available, usable, and useful to devise policies. By analyzing the barriers, both administrative and technical, to carbon data circulation, I aim at delivering practical knowledge of how this new carbon governance can be implemented in remote Arctic communities. In this work, I'm not alone. I have recently become a member of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. It's an international program. We are 16 scholars from different Arctic countries. And our goal is to investigate how can we make Arctic communities more resilient and Arctic economies more sustainable, and by pulling our expertise together, deliver policy recommendations to the Arctic Council and other relevant Arctic stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daria. Does our audience have questions already for Daria?
Thank you for your presentation. Can you maybe please elaborate a bit more on carbon data? What do you exactly imply by saying this?
Right. So basically, when we think about carbon, we can think about human production of carbon and also the natural carbon circulation. So in the first place, I think where we have to start, and what would be a natural starting point, is to try to understand what kind of carbon emissions are being produced in the Arctic communities. And we have to start by disaggregating it and by trying to collect the data. But actually, nobody has really ever tried to do this. So who are the stakeholders? When we're going after diesel, when we go after heating, when we go after industries and transport, nobody actually has ever tried to pull it together and even find people who would have the data. So we don't have an idea about that. And then we can start putting this into the more global context of how much carbon is being absorbed by the ecosystem and also how much carbon is being emitted. And of course, there is a lot of research right now on the side of natural sciences trying to figure out how much carbon is actually being emitted in the Arctic. But I think it would be a very good starting point to start with the human communities.
I really want to ask Daria a pretty specific question. We also know that the development in the Arctic is also affecting shipping and the shipping industry. Could you tell us a bit about how all these changes are affecting shipping?
Right, thanks a lot for this question as well. So basically at the moment, we can see two big business narratives in the Arctic. One of them is energy and another one is shipping. And they're actually closely related because shipping would be the main way of transporting energy that we are extracting from the Arctic outside to the consumer markets. So in this way, and this is the argument that I have put forward in my previous research, it's productive to see Arctic in this kind of neo-colonial terms, or what I term resource colonialism, because the resources that are being extracted from the Arctic are actually not needed in the Arctic. They are being extracted for some other locations elsewhere in the world. And this is where shipping comes into play.
Very, very interesting. Can you still say something about how it looks at the moment? What kind of players are there currently involved in the shipping and also energy extraction business?
Right, so it depends really at where we're looking at, because we have the Russian Arctic that is quite different from Canadian Arctic, and it's again quite different from, let's say, Greenland, and how these developments play out in the different areas, in the different parts of the Arctic. Yet, what is interesting that those issues of energy poverty and the issues of increasing ship traffic and its impact on indigenous peoples, they are pan-Arctic. They are not specific to any country in the Arctic, but they are more of a all-Arctic nature. And the players are very much in vein of this resource colonialism, are international companies, transnational companies that are coming to the Arctic. But then, of course, the question is, whom are they meeting in the Arctic? And this really depends on which country they are going to. So in Canada, they will very often meet indigenous corporations, whereas in Russia, they will be more meeting the local authorities that do not necessarily represent the interests of the local indigenous communities.
An extremely interesting vein of thought again. Thank you, Daria, for a great presentation, really good also answers, and thank you, the audience.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.